The morning air bit at Marcus Langston's knuckles as he stepped out of his midnight blue Cadillac Escalade, its engine still humming faintly in the circular driveway of the Meridian Hotel in downtown Palo Alto. The sun hung low, casting a brittle light across the pavement, glinting off the car's chrome edges like a warning flare. His oxblood loafers struck the ground with a crisp, deliberate thud, each step a declaration. His charcoal gray suit, tailored to a razor's edge, clung to his broad frame, the fabric catching the dawn in subtle, steely glints. He adjusted his cufflinks, silver, engraved with ML, and straightened his tie, a deep burgundy that spoke of intention, precision, power. This wasn't a man arriving for a casual visit. This was a titan stepping into a space that didn't yet know it was about to be judged. The lobby loomed ahead, its glass doors reflecting the world outside in cold, distorted shards. No red carpet, no fanfare, just the sterile gleam of wealth, a monument to exclusivity. Marcus's breath fogged briefly in the chill as he approached, his briefcase swinging lightly in his grip. The valet, a wiry kid named Tyler, blonde hair spilling over a faded hotel polo, stood 10 feet away, hands shoved in his pockets. His eyes flicked to Marcus, then darted away, locking onto the cracked screen of his phone like it was a lifeline. Marcus dangled his keys, the jingle slicing through the quiet. No response, no movement, just the distant clatter of a delivery truck and the faint rustle of leaves skittering across the drive. "Morning," Marcus said, his voice low, steady, a thread of steel woven through it. Tyler flinched, barely looking up. "You parking this, or am I?" Marcus asked, holding the keys out, his gaze unwavering. Tyler muttered something about being swamped, his eyes sliding past Marcus to a dented Honda pulling in behind. "Hey, grab this one, will you?" he called to his coworker, a stocky guy wiping sweat from his brow with a sleeve. Marcus wasn't invisible. He was just irrelevant. The dismissal wasn't loud, wasn't overt. It was a quiet erasure, the kind he'd felt 1,000 times before. He exhaled through his nose, a slow hiss of restraint, and walked to the parking lot himself. The Escalade's door shut with a solid thunk, and he crossed the drive again, each step measured, his shadow stretching long and sharp in the morning light. The glass doors parted with a soft hiss, and he stepped into the lobby, marble floors polished to a mirror sheen, chandeliers dripping with crystal, air thick with the scent of lavender and money. At the front desk, Claire, mid-30s, blonde bob clipped tight, name tag slightly askew, tapped at her keyboard, her nails clicking like a metronome. She didn't look up. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat, mechanical, eyes still glued to the screen. Marcus set his briefcase down, the sound echoing in the cavernous space like a gavel strike. "Yes," he said, his tone even but firm. "I'm here for the Tech Vision Summit. The Sequoia room should be reserved for us." Claire's fingers paused mid-keystroke. She glanced up, her gaze sweeping over him, his suit, his stance, the quiet authority in his posture, then dropped back to her monitor. "Are you with one of the vendors?" she asked, her words laced with an assumption so casual it bordered on insult. Marcus tilted his head, just enough to signal he'd caught the undertone. "No," he said, his voice steady as granite. "I'm the CEO." Her eyes flicked up again, narrowing briefly, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "Right," she said, unconvinced, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Could you wait outside? We're still setting up." No apology, no hesitation, just a directive, delivered with the same indifference she might use to shoo a stray cat from the doorstep. He didn't move. "I'm also the keynote speaker," he added, his tone unchanged but now carrying a faint edge, a challenge she couldn't miss. Claire's tight smile didn't falter. "Still not ready," she said, her voice clipped. "Please wait outside." Before Marcus could respond, a figure emerged from behind her. Ethan, early 20s, cheap blazer stretched across narrow shoulders, a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt like a toy soldier's badge. "You with security?" Ethan asked, his eyes raking over Marcus, lingering on his height, his build, as if searching for a threat. Marcus met his stare, unblinking. "I'm Marcus Langston," he said, each syllable deliberate, weighted. "I run this conference, the one you're hosting today." Ethan tilted his head toward the door, a gesture so casual it was almost lazy. "Just give us a minute, sir. We'll call someone." The absurdity hung there, thick and heavy, a silent dare. Marcus didn't laugh, didn't snap. He let it sit, let it fester, his expression a mask of calm that hid the storm brewing beneath. Outside, he stood on the pavement again, the cold seeping through his soles. A white guy in a rumpled blazer, some investor type, hair thinning, tie loose, strolled through the doors, greeted by Claire's sudden smile and Ethan's eager nod. Handshakes followed, warm and effortless, the lobby swallowing him up like he belonged there. Marcus watched, his jaw tight, his breath steady. The contrast wasn't subtle. It was a blade, sharp and familiar, cutting through the morning haze. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "Boss," came Malik's voice, sharp and alert, his assistant's tone cutting through the static. "They roll out the red carpet yet?" Marcus stared at the glass doors, his reflection staring back, tall, black, unshaken. "Not exactly," he said, his voice low, controlled. "They told me to wait outside." A pause on the line, not shock, just recognition. Malik knew that tone, quiet, measured, dangerous. "Want me to come down?" he asked. "No," Marcus said. "Stay with the investors. I'll handle it." He hung up, straightened his tie, and turned back to the doors. The world moved on around him, a mother pushing a stroller across the street, a bus wheezing to a stop at the corner, the faint hum of life indifferent to the moment. Marcus stood there, a man who'd clawed his way from nothing to everything, reduced to a shadow on the sidewalk because he didn't fit their picture. He checked his watch. 8:09 a.m. His speech was 51 minutes away. He had time. But something colder than anger was rising inside him, a resolve, hard and unyielding, forged in a lifetime of moments just like this. Oakland, 1998. The air smelled of asphalt and diesel, thick with the heat of a late summer afternoon. Marcus Langston, 12 years old, skinny legs poking out of frayed shorts, pushed open the door to Mr. Patel's corner store, the bell jangling overhead. His sneakers, hand-me-downs from his cousin, soles worn thin, squeaked against the linoleum. He clutched a crumpled dollar bill in his fist, earned from sweeping Mrs. Carter's porch down the block. A Snickers bar sat on the counter, its wrapper glinting under the fluorescent lights, a small prize he'd been eyeing all week. Mr. Patel, gray hair slicked back, stood behind the register, his eyes narrowing as Marcus stepped inside. "What you want, kid?" he asked, his voice gruff, his gaze tracking Marcus's every move. "Just this," Marcus said, sliding the dollar across the counter, his fingers brushing the candy. Patel didn't touch the money. He leaned forward, his shadow falling over Marcus like a net. "You got anything else in those pockets?" he asked, his tone sharp, accusing. Marcus froze, the heat of shame creeping up his neck. "No, sir," he said, his voice small but steady. Patel snorted, crossing his arms. "Empty 'em out, now!" Marcus hesitated, then turned his pockets inside out. Lint, a broken pencil, nothing more. Patel's frown deepened, but he snatched the dollar and shoved the Snickers across the counter. "Don't come back unless you're buying something real," he muttered. Marcus grabbed the candy and bolted, the bell clanging behind him as he hit the street, heart pounding, the taste of humiliation bitter on his tongue. He didn't tell his father that night. He didn't need to. Henry Langston saw it in his son's eyes when he slumped into their cramped apartment, the Snickers uneaten in his hand. Henry, broad-shouldered, hands calloused from years at the steel mill, sat at the kitchen table, a chipped mug of coffee cooling in front of him. The room was dim, lit by a single bulb flickering overhead, the walls stained with years of wear. "What happened?" Henry asked, his voice a low rumble, steady as the machines he worked. Marcus shrugged, staring at the floor. "Nothing," he mumbled. Henry set the mug down, the sound sharp in the quiet. "Don't lie to me, boy," he said, not angry, just firm. Marcus looked up, his eyes meeting his father's, dark, deep, unyielding. "Mr. Patel thought I was stealing," he admitted, the words spilling out. "Made me show my pockets. I didn't do anything." Henry's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the skin. He didn't curse, didn't shout. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a yell. "Listen to me, Marcus," he said. "They're going to look at you and see what they want to see. Not who you are, not what you could be. You can't change their eyes, but you can change what you do about it. Don't knock on doors they won't open. Build your own." Marcus nodded, the words sinking in, rooting themselves deep. Henry reached over, squeezed his shoulder, and went back to his coffee. It wasn't comfort. It was a charge, a seed planted in soil already cracked by the world. 2 years later, Marcus sat in that same kitchen, a hulking desktop computer whirring on the table, a thrift store find, its beige case scratched and dented. The screen glowed blue, casting shadows across his face, now sharper, harder, at 14. His fingers danced over the keys, lines of code scrolling past. Basic, clumsy but alive. A language he'd taught himself from a library book, with dog-eared pages. The apartment was silent, Henry at the night shift, the hum of the machine his only company. Outside, sirens wailed, a dog barked, the city grinding on. Inside, Marcus built something, small, fragile, but his. He didn't know it then, but that flickering screen was his first door. Not the one Patel had slammed shut, not the one the world kept locked. This was his own, carved from stubborn will and late nights, the glow of it lighting a path he couldn't yet see. He typed faster, the clack of the keys a rhythm, a defiance. The shame from that corner store still lingered, but it wasn't a weight anymore. It was fuel. He'd build something they couldn't ignore, something they couldn't take. And he'd start right here, in the dark, with nothing but a machine and a promise. Stanford, 2008. The dorm room smelled of stale pizza and burnt coffee, the air thick with the buzz of ambition. Marcus Langston, 22, leaned over a laptop on a rickety desk, its surface scarred with pen marks and soda rings. His hair was cropped short, his frame lean but solid, the years of Oakland grit etched into his posture. The screen glowed with a prototype, lines of code he'd written, a platform to connect startups with micro-investors, a seed that would grow into Langston Innovations. Outside, the campus hummed with late-night chatter. But in here, it was just him and the future. Malik Jackson sprawled on the bed, flipping through a textbook he wasn't reading. "You still tweaking that thing?" he asked, his voice lazy but sharp, a grin tugging at his lips. Malik, tall, wiry, a poli-sci major with a knack for reading people, had been Marcus's roommate since freshman year, his cynicism a perfect foil to Marcus's drive. "It's not ready," Marcus said, not looking up, his fingers flying over the keys. "Needs to be perfect." Malik snorted. "Perfect's overrated. Just don't crash it in front of the prof tomorrow." The prof was Dr. Harold Grayson, a Stanford legend, gray beard, sharper tongue, gatekeeper to the computer science department's elite. Marcus had signed up for his seminar, a shot at mentorship, a chance to pitch his idea. But Grayson had other plans. The next day, in a lecture hall packed with eager faces, Marcus stood at the front, his laptop hooked to a projector, the prototype flickering on the screen. "This platform," he began, his voice steady, "bridges the gap between small startups and investors who don't have millions to throw around. It's democratizing capital." Grayson sat in the back, arms crossed, his expression a wall of skepticism. The room listened, some nodded, some scribbled notes. But Grayson's silence was louder than their interest. When Marcus finished, the professor stood, his voice cutting through the hum. "Interesting concept, Mr. Langston," he said, pausing just long enough to let the compliment curdle. "But I don't see the potential. Too niche, too risky. I won't be taking you on." The words landed like a punch, the room shifting uncomfortably. Marcus didn't flinch. "Appreciate the feedback," he said, his tone even, his eyes locked on Grayson's. "I'll figure it out." He did. Alone. Nights bled into mornings, the dorm a blur of code and caffeine. Malik stuck around, less for the tech and more for the loyalty, tossing ideas when Marcus hit walls. Sasha Nguyen joined later, short, fierce, a business major with a mind like a blade. She'd overheard Marcus pitching in the cafeteria, cornered him after and said, "You need someone to sell this. I'm in." Jamal Carter came last, a freshman coder, quiet, brilliant, shadowing Marcus like a disciple. Together, they turned the prototype into a beta, then a product, then a company. The first investor meeting came in 2010, a cramped office in Menlo Park, the air stale with desperation and hope. The investor, Tom Ellis, mid-40s, balding, skeptical, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You're young," he said, eyeing Marcus across the table. "And this is unproven. Why should I risk 10 grand on you?" Marcus slid a folder over, projections, user data, a vision typed out in black and white. "Because I've built something that works," he said, his voice calm, unshakable. "And because I don't quit." Ellis stared at him, then at the folder, then back. "All right," he said finally, a grin breaking through. 10,000, don't screw it up." Marcus signed the contract that night, his pen steady, his eyes alight with something fierce. Ambition, yes, but also defiance. Grayson hadn't seen the potential. Ellis had. And Marcus would make damn sure the world did too. Langston Innovations was born, a spark in a dorm room now aflame, and he'd carry it forward, step by relentless step, until no one could look away. The Meridian Hotel's lobby, once a pristine shrine of luxury, unraveled into chaos within minutes of Marcus Langston's command. He stood just beyond the glass doors, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a blade cutting through the morning haze. "Sasha," he said, his tone low and unyielding, "move the summit to the Orion, now. Cancel everything here. Suites, catering, the works. Charge the penalty to me if they push back." On the other end, Sasha Nguyen, his COO, sharp as a tack, didn't hesitate. "Understood," she said, her voice clipped, already shifting gears. "This about principle?" Marcus's eyes narrowed, fixed on the hotel's gleaming facade. "Always," he replied, and hung up. Inside, the scene was a slow-motion collapse. Claire, the receptionist, stood behind the desk, her blonde bob trembling as her fingers fumbled over the keyboard. The screen flashed with red alerts, cancellations piling up like dominoes, but she couldn't process it fast enough. "They're leaving," she muttered, her voice rising, a crack splintering her usual composure. Ethan, the blazer-clad security kid, hovered near the wall, his walkie-talkie silent, his eyes darting anywhere but Marcus. He'd shrunk into himself, a shadow of the swagger he'd wielded moments ago when he'd asked Marcus to step outside. The manager, late 40s, slick hair graying at the temples, tie askew, finally emerged from a back office, his face tight with a mix of panic and denial. "Mr. Langston," he said, his voice oily with forced calm. "I heard there was a misunderstanding. Let me apologize." Marcus cut him off, his words precise, lethal. "You didn't offend me," he said, stepping closer, his shadow falling across the marble floor. "You disqualified yourselves. You're out of the game." The manager blinked, mouth opening, but no sound came. Marcus turned, his briefcase swinging lightly, and walked out, leaving the words to echo in the hollow space. Outside, Malik, his assistant, lean and quick, met him at the curb, already coordinating with the team. "Investors are asking questions," Malik said, his phone buzzing incessantly. "Told them it's an emergency relocation. They're intrigued, not pissed, yet." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "Keep them moving. No one thanks the Meridian on the way out." Malik grinned, a flash of teeth, and darted off, weaving through the growing crowd of summit attendees spilling onto the sidewalk. Back inside, the chaos deepened. Claire's screen froze, a cascade of error messages swallowing her attempts to stem the tide. "The suites are canceling," she hissed to Ethan, who shrugged helplessly, his walkie-talkie crackling with static. Housekeeping staff wheeled carts of untouched linens through the lobby, their chatter a low hum of confusion. The manager paced, barking orders. "Call the GM! Get me the event coordinator!" But no one moved fast enough. The air thickened with the stench of desperation, a luxury hotel crumbling under the weight of its own misstep. Victor Hargrove watched it all from a distance, his office perched on the Meridian's top floor, a glass-walled perch overlooking Palo Alto's skyline. Regional director of the Meridian chain, Hargrove was a man of angles, sharp cheekbones, sharper suits, a mind honed by decades of control. He'd issued the directive months ago, a quiet memo to staff. Monitor guests who don't fit the profile, keep the image clean. It wasn't overt racism, not on paper. It was a system, a filter, a way to protect the brand from undesirables. And Marcus Langston, tall, black, commanding, had tripped that wire the moment he'd walked in. Hargrove sipped his espresso, the cup clinking against its saucer as he set it down. His phone buzzed, Claire frantic, reporting the exodus. "Fix it," he snapped, his voice cold, detached. "He's just one man." But as he watched the black SUV pull up outside, Marcus climbing in with a grace that belied the storm he'd unleashed, Hargrove felt a flicker of unease. This wasn't just one man. This was a reckoning. Jamal Carter burst into the Orion Hotel's makeshift command center, an empty conference room now buzzing with Langston Innovations staff, his laptop clutched under his arm like a weapon. "Boss," he said, breathless, his eyes wide behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You need to see this." Marcus turned from the window, where he'd been watching investors filter into the Orion's sunlit atrium, their murmurs a low hum of curiosity. The glass framed a world moving forward, oblivious to the storm brewing within these walls. He took the laptop, its screen glowing with scanned documents, internal Meridian memos, each page stamped with Victor Hargrove's initials in a cold, bureaucratic scrawl. "Guest of concern," Marcus read aloud, his voice steady, but laced with a quiet fury that seemed to hum beneath his words. The phrase repeated across pages, a sinister code tied to check-ins, flagged for extra scrutiny with chilling precision. The pattern was unmistakable. Black guests, Latino guests, anyone who didn't match the Meridian's polished, pale ideal, a sanitized vision of wealth and privilege that excluded by design. Jamal pointed to a highlighted line, his finger trembling slightly. "They used it on you," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "This morning, marked you before you even said a word." Marcus scrolled, each page a brick in a wall he'd been slamming against his whole life. Each click of the mouse a hammer strike against decades of silent indignities. His fingers tightened on the laptop's edges, the plastic creaking faintly. But his face remained a mask, anger simmering, not boiling over. A fire banked for the right moment. The room went still, Sasha and Malik watching him, waiting for the spark to ignite. Their silence was heavy, a shared understanding of what this meant, not just for Marcus, but for all of them. "They didn't just misjudge me," Marcus said finally, setting the laptop down with a deliberate thud that echoed in the cramped space. "They targeted me." His mind flashed back, 2015, a new Tesla gleaming in his driveway, a gift to himself after Langston's first $1 million quarter. He'd taken it out, the engine purring through Oakland's quieter streets, the night air cool against his skin. Red and blue lights flared behind him, sudden and jarring, like a predator's eyes in the dark. Two cops, hands on holsters, demanded his license, their questions sharp. "Whose car is this? Where'd you get it?" He'd explained, calmly, hands visible, heart pounding. But the disbelief in their eyes burned, a brand pressed into his memory. They'd let him go, no ticket, just a warning to watch himself, their voices dripping with condescension. The memory stung, a wound reopened, raw and festering, but now he held power they couldn't touch. Power he'd forged from the ashes of moments like that. He stared at the laptop, the screen now dimming, and let the weight of it settle. This wasn't just about him. It was every black man who'd walked into a space and felt the air shift. Every Latino family flagged for extra checks because their names didn't fit the guest list's rhythm. It was a system, not a mistake, a machine built to grind down anyone who didn't reflect its narrow mirror. His chest tightened, not with rage, but with a cold, unyielding clarity. He'd seen this before, felt it in his bones, but now it was inked in black and white, a confession from the Meridian's own hand. Sasha crossed her arms, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade through fog. "We can sue," she said, her tone all business, her eyes glinting with the promise of a fight. "This is a gold mine, discrimination, paper trail, the works. We'd bury them in court, Marcus. They wouldn't see daylight for years." Marcus shook his head, his gaze drifting back to the window, where the investors' shadows danced against the glass. "No lawsuits," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "That's their game, dragging it out, burying it in legalese, turning it into a circus where they can hide. We go public, quietly. Let the truth do the work." Sasha raised an eyebrow, a flicker of skepticism crossing her face, but she nodded. "Your call," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But they won't go down easy. Hargrove's got deeper pockets than we think." Jamal piped up, hesitant, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's more," he said, pulling up another file with a nervous tap. "Emails from Hargrove to staff. Maintain standards. Discretion is key. He's the architect, Marcus, not just some middleman." The screen filled with correspondence, terse directives, coded language, a blueprint for exclusion dressed up as professionalism. One email, dated 3 months prior, stood out. "Profile high-risk guests at entry. Appearance matters. Keep it subtle. Subtle. The word twisted in Marcus's gut like a knife. He leaned back, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening precision. This wasn't a fluke, a bad day at the front desk. It was a machine, oiled by policy, grinding against anyone who didn't fit, its gears turning long before he'd stepped through those glass doors. Malik, who'd been silent until now, stepped forward, his lean frame tense, his eyes dark with something unspoken. "This ain't new," he said, his voice low, rough around the edges. "You know that, right? They've been doing this forever. Hotels, stores, cops, all of them. Same playbook, different uniforms." Marcus met his gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Malik had his own scars, stopped and frisked at 16, shadowed in department stores at 20. Always the concern in someone's ledger. "I know," Marcus said, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "That's why we don't play their game. We change the board." He closed the laptop, the sound sharp in the quiet, a punctuation mark on the moment. "Get this ready," he told Jamal, his tone shifting to command. "We release it tonight. No fanfare, no speeches, just the facts, raw and unfiltered." Jamal nodded, already typing, his fingers a blur against the keys, a soldier falling into step. Marcus turned back to the window, his reflection faint against the glass, the summit's hum a distant pulse. He thought of his father's words, "Build your own door," and felt them resonate now, louder than ever. This wasn't about tearing down the Meridian, not yet. It was about shining a light into its corners, exposing the rot they had buried under marble and chandeliers. Sasha lingered, her arms still crossed, studying him. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice quieter now, probing. "Once it's out, there's no pulling it back. Hargrove will come for us, legal or otherwise." Marcus didn't turn, his eyes fixed on the atrium below, where a young black coder, maybe 20, badge gleaming, laughed with an investor. "I'm sure," he said, his voice steel-wrapped in velvet. "They've hidden long enough. Let them feel the weight of being seen." Malik clapped a hand on Jamal's shoulder, breaking the tension. "Better make it airtight, kid," he said, a grin tugging at his lips. "Boss ain't messing around." Jamal nodded, his focus unwavering, the laptop's glow illuminating his determination. Outside, the summit carried on, investors none the wiser, their world still spinning on its polished axis. But Marcus felt the weight shift, not relief, not victory, just the cold clarity of a man who'd seen the enemy's face and chosen his weapon. This wasn't about revenge, though the thought flickered at the edges of his mind, tempting and sharp. It was about exposing a system that thrived in the shadows, one he'd dismantle brick by brick, not with fists but with the quiet, unrelenting force of truth. Evelyn Carver's office sat high above San Francisco, a glass cage perched on the 40th floor of Apex Ventures' sleek headquarters. The walls shimmered with reflections of the bay, their transparency a deceptive promise of openness, while the desk, a slab of polished ebony, held nothing but a laptop and a single Mont Blanc pen, its austerity a mirror to her soul. The room was a study in control, no clutter, no warmth, just the stark lines of power etched into every surface. She was 52, her hair a silver bob cut with surgical precision, her suit a crisp navy that cost more than most people's rent, a bespoke creation from a London tailor who catered to the elite. Her eyes, pale blue and piercing, scanned an email from Victor Hargrove. "Langston's pulling out, summit's gone, staff in disarray." She smirked, a thin, humorless curve of her lips, and typed back with deliberate keystrokes. "Contain it. He's a nuisance, not a threat." Her fingers hovered over the send button for a moment, then pressed down, the click a quiet declaration of her unshakable confidence. Evelyn wasn't just an investor, she was a kingmaker, a shadow behind half the tech boom's gilded doors. Apex Ventures funded startups, yes, but its reach extended far beyond Silicon Valley's venture capital playground. It owned stakes in hotel chains like Meridian, discreetly enforcing a clean image that kept the elite comfortable and the others, those who didn't fit the mold of wealth and whiteness, out of sight. Hargrove was her tool, a loyal lieutenant who'd climbed the ranks by following her unspoken rules, his ambition tethered to her will. She'd built this network over decades, a web of influence that stretched from boardrooms to lobbies, all designed to maintain order, her order. It was a system she'd perfected, a machine that hummed with quiet efficiency, its gears lubricated by the unspoken agreement of those who benefited from its exclusions. Her rise hadn't been accidental. 30 years ago, Evelyn had been a junior analyst at a failing investment firm in Chicago, a sharp-eyed 22-year-old buried under stacks of financial reports in a basement office that reeked of mildew. The firm's partners, old men with cigars and paunches, had dismissed her, their laughter echoing down the hall when she'd pitched her first deal. "Stick to the numbers, sweetheart," one had said, patting her head like she was a child. She'd smiled then, a tight, practiced curve of her lips, and spent the next 6 months dismantling their complacency. She'd uncovered a loophole in a competitor's merger, fed it to a rival firm, and watched the partners scramble as their stock tanked. When the dust settled, she'd walked out with a job offer from Apex's predecessor, her heels clicking on the cracked linoleum, her mind already mapping a path to the top. That memory lingered now, a cold ember in her chest, a reminder that power wasn't given, it was taken, piece by calculated piece. Her phone pinged, an alert from a news aggregator she'd programmed to track her interests. Tech Vision Summit relocates from Meridian to Orion. She clicked, her smirk fading as she read the subtext. Langston's move wasn't just logistics. It was a statement, a deliberate jab at the Meridian's polished facade, and, by extension, at her. The article was sparse, but the implications were thick. Marcus Langston had turned a routine conference into a battlefield, and he'd done it without raising his voice. She leaned back in her leather chair, fingers steepled, the cold air of the office wrapping around her like a cloak. "Interesting," she murmured, her voice a low hum, barely audible over the faint whir of the building's ventilation system. This wasn't a tantrum, it was a chess move, and she respected the precision, even if it irritated her. She opened a new email, addressing it to Marcus Langston with a flick of her wrist. "Mr. Langston," she wrote, her words dripping with false warmth, a veneer of civility she'd mastered long ago. "Your decisiveness today caught my eye. Apex admires bold leadership. We should talk. Opportunities abound for a man of your caliber. Be careful, though. Reputation is a fragile thing." She hit send, the threat veiled but sharp. A needle slipped into a velvet glove. She didn't expect a reply, not yet. This was a seed, a test, a way to gauge how far he'd push before she needed to tighten the reins. Langston was a variable, an anomaly in her carefully calibrated equation, and she'd spent her career eliminating variables. Downstairs, her assistant, a nervous 20-something named Claire Evans, no relation to the Meridian's desk clerk, knocked softly on the glass door, her knuckles barely making a sound. "Ma'am," she said, her voice trembling, a faint quiver that grated on Evelyn's nerves. "Hargrove's on line 1. He's insistent." Claire's brown hair was pulled into a messy bun, her blouse wrinkled at the edges, a stark contrast to Evelyn's pristine exterior. Evelyn waved her off with a flick of her hand, her tone ice. "Tell him to handle it," she said, her eyes not leaving the window. "He knows the playbook. If he can't manage a little turbulence, he's no use to me." Claire hesitated, her mouth opening as if to protest, then snapped shut. "Yes, ma'am," she muttered, scurrying out, her flats whispering against the carpet. Evelyn turned to the window, the city sprawling below like a chessboard, its lights flickering in the late morning fog. Marcus Langston was a pawn who'd just stepped out of line, a piece she hadn't accounted for in her meticulous game. She'd underestimated him, not his ability, but his audacity. That was a mistake, one she wouldn't repeat. Her mind churned, mapping the moves ahead. Hargrove would stabilize the Meridian, spin the narrative, offer discounts and platitudes to smooth the ripples. But Langston, he required a different approach. He wasn't the type to bend under pressure. She'd seen that in the way he'd walked away from the Meridian, head high, unbothered by the chaos in his wake. No, he'd need to be outmaneuvered, his momentum redirected, his allies peeled away one by one. She tapped her pen against the desk, a rhythmic tap, tap, tap that filled the silence. Langston's company, Langston Innovations, was a rising star, its valuation climbing with each quarter. Its tech, a quiet revolution in the startup ecosystem. She'd reviewed the dossier her team had compiled, founded in a Stanford dorm, bootstrapped with grit and a single investor's seed money, now a player with $60 million in revenue. Impressive, but vulnerable. Its strength was its leader, and that was its weakness too. cut the head and the body would falter. She'd done it before, toppled CEOs with whispers, rumors, a well-placed leak to the right journalist. Langston would be no different, though his defiance added a layer of complexity she hadn't anticipated. Her phone buzzed again. Another email, this time from an Apex board member, a terse note about the Meridian fallout. Stocks dipping, investors asking questions. Fix this. She deleted it without replying, her lips pressing into a thin line. The board was a pack of nervous dogs, barking at shadows, but they'd fall in line once she restored order. She stood, smoothing her suit, and crossed to a filing cabinet tucked against the wall, a sleek steel unit that held her private records. She pulled a drawer, retrieving a slim folder labeled Langston M. Inside were clippings, financials, a photo from a tech conference, Marcus, tall and composed, speaking to a crowd, his presence magnetic even in grainy print. She studied the photo, her eyes narrowing. He wasn't just a nuisance, he was a threat, a man who'd turned her system's quiet efficiency against it. She'd underestimated his reach, his willingness to burn bridges. That ended now. She'd move her pieces soon enough. Hargrove to contain the immediate damage, Apex's resources to pressure Langston's investors, a few calls to her media contacts to plant seeds of doubt. But first, she'd let him feel the weight of her attention, let him wonder how deep her influence ran. She closed the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and returned to her desk, the city's hum a distant pulse below. The game was on, and Evelyn Carver played to win. At 8:00 p.m., Langston Innovations dropped the bomb. No press conference, no hashtags, just a sleek PDF uploaded to their site, titled Meridian Internal Policies, a Record of Bias. The memos, the codes, Hargrove's emails, all laid bare, unedited, undeniable, a digital guillotine slicing through the Meridian's polished veneer. Within an hour, X ignited, the platform's algorithm amplifying the outrage like wildfire through dry grass. Meridian flags, black guests as concerns. One post read, retweeted 1,000 times, its question mark a dagger of disbelief. Langston just exposed the whole damn system, another declared, the words bolded for emphasis, racking up likes by the minute. By 9:30, a dozen protesters gathered outside the Meridian's Palo Alto entrance, their signs scrawled with "No room for racism" and "Boycott Meridian" in thick black marker, their chants a low roar in the night, punctuated by the occasional honk of a passing car. The protesters were a mix, young tech workers in hoodies, a few older locals with graying hair, a college student clutching a megaphone that crackled with static. "We see you, Meridian," she shouted, her voice raw but steady, her breath fogging in the cool air. A man beside her, mid-30s, held a sign aloft. Respect isn't optional. The group was small, barely a crowd, but their presence was a spark, a signal that Langston's move had pierced the surface of apathy. Across the street, a news van pulled up, its crew scrambling to set up cameras, their lights casting harsh beams on the hotel's glass facade. The story was growing legs, and Marcus's quiet strike was the match that lit it. Inside the hotel, Victor Hargrove paced his office, a corner suite with a view now marred by the flickering protest signs below. His phone was a lifeline to a sinking ship, its screen glowing with missed calls and frantic texts. "We're issuing a statement," he barked to his PR team over speakerphone, his voice hoarse, edged with desperation. "Discounts, apologies, standard playbook. This blows over by morning." But it didn't. The statement, "We're investigating these allegations and regret any discomfort," landed like a wet rag, limp and useless, mocked online as spineless within minutes of its release. "Discomfort? You mean racism," one ex-user shot back, the post gaining traction faster than Hargrove's team could refresh their screens. By midnight, 3 smaller tech firms canceled their bookings, citing scheduling conflicts and terse emails, their silence louder than any protest, a quiet exodus that spoke of fear and shifting loyalties. Marcus watched it unfold from his office at Langston Innovations, the skyline dark beyond the glass, a canvas of stars and city lights that offered no answers. Malik leaned against the doorframe, scrolling X on his phone, his grin a rare break in the tension. "They're pissed," he said, his voice light but his eyes sharp. "You lit a match, boss, and it's burning hot." Marcus didn't smile, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Wasn't the goal, he said, his voice low, steady, a thread of steel running through it. But I'm not dousing it. Sasha joined them, her tablet glowing with analytics, her short frame radiating a quiet intensity. Stocks holding, she said, tapping the screen. Investors like the optics, standing up, not backing down. Some are even calling it a power move. Malik chuckled, pocketing his phone. Power move, huh? More like a damn earthquake. You see the comments? People are digging up old Meridian reviews. Same crap, different cities. This ain't just Palo Alto's problem now. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. He'd expected pushback, maybe a ripple. But this was a wave, uncontrolled, unpredictable, washing over more than he'd planned. Good, he said finally. Let it spread. They've been comfortable too long. Sasha glanced at him, her brow furrowing. You sure we're ready for this? She asked, her tone probing. It's not just Meridian anymore. Hargrove's got friends, big ones. They'll hit back. Marcus met her eyes, unflinching. Let them try, he said. We've got the truth. That's enough for now. Not everyone agreed. Richard Ellis, one of the board's old guard, a white-haired financier who'd backed Marcus early with a 10-grand check and a handshake, called an emergency meeting, his face a grid of pixels on the Zoom screen. This is reckless, he said, his voice tight, his jowls trembling slightly with indignation. You're turning a business into a crusade, Marcus. The backlash could tank us. Stock dips, clients bolting, lawsuits. You're gambling everything on a principle. Marcus leaned into the camera, his expression stone, his eyes dark and unyielding. I didn't build this company to bow to people like them, he said, each word a hammer strike. If you're scared of the heat, Richard, step out of the kitchen. I'll carry it alone if I have to. The line went silent, Richard's jaw working, his lips parting, then closing as if tasting a retort he couldn't spit out. He didn't push, not yet, but the tension lingered, a fault line waiting to crack. Marcus ended the call, the screen going black, and turned back to the window. He thought of the protesters below the Meridian, their voices faint but persistent, a chorus he hadn't summoned but couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every name flagged in those memos, every face turned away at a desk like Claire's, every kid who'd felt the sting of being other in a world that promised fairness but delivered fences. He'd started this to expose a single hotel, but the roots ran deeper, tangled in decades of quiet complicity. The weight of it pressed against his chest. Not fear, not doubt, just the gravity of a fight he hadn't fully mapped. Outside, the war raged on, quiet, relentless. A tide Marcus had started but couldn't control. He didn't want to. This wasn't about winning applause, though the cheers on X were loud and growing. It was about tearing the mask off a system that thrived on silence, a system that had whispered its rules in every sidelong glance, every coded memo, every locked door. He'd keep pulling until it broke, until the pieces lay scattered and the light poured in. He leaned against the glass, the cool surface grounding him, and watched the city pulse below. The match was lit, the fire spreading, and he'd stand in its glow, unflinching, until the shadows had nowhere left to hide. The email from Evelyn Carver landed in Marcus Langston's inbox at 7:32 a.m., a crisp, calculated intrusion amid the chaos of the previous day's fallout. Mr. Langston, let's discuss this over coffee. Apex Ventures, 10 a.m. The words stared back at him from his laptop screen, stark against the soft glow of his office at Langston Innovations. His coffee sat untouched on the desk, steam curling upward in lazy tendrils, cooling as he read the message twice, first to absorb it, then to dissect it. Evelyn's tone was polished, almost cordial, but Marcus knew better. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a chess move. He forwarded the email to Sasha Nguyen, his COO, with a single line. She's on the board. Sasha strode in minutes later, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, a tablet tucked under her arm. She's moving, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, his voice low, steady, a thread of steel woven through it. Fast. Sasha smirked, a sharp glint in her dark eyes. She's rattled, she replied, setting the tablet down. Good. Means we hit her where it hurts. Marcus nodded, his gaze drifting to the window where the city skyline shimmered faintly through the morning fog. Let's see what she's got, he said, already mapping the confrontation in his mind. The Apex Ventures building loomed over Market Street like a sentinel, its glass facade a monolith that swallowed the fog and spat back distorted reflections of San Francisco's restless pulse. Marcus stepped into the lobby at 9:55 a.m., his charcoal gray suit crisp, the burgundy tie a quiet declaration of defiance. His stride was unbroken, purposeful, each step echoing faintly on the polished granite floor. The receptionist, a young woman with a tight bun and a nervous smile, barely glanced up as she waved him toward the elevators. 40th floor, she murmured, her voice swallowed by the hum of the building's machinery. The elevator ascent was a silent climb, the numbers ticking upward in red digits, the air growing colder with each floor. Marcus adjusted his cufflinks, silver, engraved with ML, and checked his reflection in the mirrored walls. His face was a mask, jaw set, eyes steady, the weight of yesterday's battle etched into the lines around his mouth. He wasn't here to negotiate, he was here to measure his enemy. The doors slid open, revealing a hallway lined with frosted glass and muted gray carpet, a sterile corridor that led to Evelyn Carver's domain. She waited in a conference room at the far end, walls transparent, the table a gleaming slab of black marble, her presence a quiet storm amid the stillness. She rose as he entered, a figure of calculated elegance, 52, her silver bob catching the light, her navy suit tailored to a blade's edge. "Mr. Langston," she said, extending a hand, her handshake firm but cold, her grip lingering just long enough to assert control. "You've made quite a splash." Her smile was a thin crescent, never reaching her pale, piercing eyes. They sat, the city a muted hum 40 stories below, its fog-shrouded streets invisible through the glass. Evelyn folded her hands on the table, her fingers adorned with a single gold ring, its simplicity a stark contrast to the power she wielded. "I'll keep this simple," she said, her voice silk over steel, smooth but unyielding. "Your stunt yesterday hurt Meridian, yes, but it's a blip. A minor disruption in a much larger machine. Apex can smooth it over. Partnership, resources, a way to turn this into a win for both of us. We take a stake in Langston Innovations, you get our backing, everyone walks away happy." The offer hung there, a velvet glove over a clenched fist, the steel beneath it glinting in her steady gaze. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, but his eyes locked on hers, unblinking. "I don't sell my soul to anyone," he said, each word deliberate, a brick laid in a wall she couldn't climb. "Not to Meridian, not to you." The air shifted, a subtle crack forming in Evelyn's facade, her smile tightened, the corners twitching as if resisting the urge to snap. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, her tone dropping, icy and precise, cutting through the room like a blade through fog. "You think you're untouchable because you've got the internet cheering? That fades, Mr. Langston. Power doesn't." He stood, buttoning his jacket with a slow, measured motion, his movements a quiet rebuttal to her threat. "I don't need your power," he said, his voice calm, resonant, a deep current beneath still waters. "I've got my own." She rose too, her eyes narrowing to slits, the silver of her hair catching the light like a blade's edge. "You'll regret this," she said, her smile returning, cold and lethal, a predator baring its teeth. Choosing the hard way always costs more. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't waver. "I've paid worse," he said, his tone flat final, a man who'd walked through fire and emerged unburned. He turned and walked out, the glass doors sliding shut behind him with a whisper, sealing the confrontation in a tomb of silence. The elevator ride down was a descent into stillness. The hum of the machinery, a faint pulse against his thoughts. His mind raced, replaying her words, her smile, the way she'd leaned into the threat like it was a weapon she'd honed for decades. Evelyn wasn't just a threat. She was a mirror, reflecting a world that saw him as a problem to solve, not a force to reckon with. He'd faced her kind before, corner store clerks, skeptical professors, cops with itchy trigger fingers, and he'd face her again. But this time, the stakes were higher, the battlefield broader. He stepped back into the lobby, the fog outside pressing against the glass like a living thing, obscuring the street beyond. His phone buzzed, Malik checking in. "How'd it go?" his assistant asked, his voice sharp with curiosity. "She's circling," Marcus said, stepping into the damp air, the city's chill seeping through his suit. "Offered a deal. I said no." Malik chuckled, low and knowing. Bet she loved that. Marcus didn't reply, his eyes scanning the horizon, the apex building a dark silhouette against the gray. He slid into his Escalade, the leather cool against his back, and started the engine. Evelyn's words echoed, "Choosing the hard way always costs more." But they didn't shake him. They steeled him. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a team, Malik's loyalty, Sasha's ferocity, Jamal's brilliance, a company forged from his own hands, a legacy he'd die before letting her touch. The confrontation wasn't over. It was just the opening salvo. And as the car pulled onto Market Street, disappearing into the fog, Marcus knew he'd fight with every piece of what he'd built, every lesson he'd learned, every door he'd forced open. Evelyn wanted a war. She'd get one. But it wouldn't be loud, wouldn't be brash. It would be his way, quiet, relentless, a force she'd never see coming until it was too late. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his own eyes staring back, steady and unyielding. This wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about proving himself right, to the kid he'd been, to the man he'd become, to the world he was reshaping one calculated step at a time. The first blow came at dawn, sharp and silent, like a blade slipping between ribs. Marcus Langston stood in his office, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing a Palo Alto skyline, still cloaked in pre-dawn gray. His phone buzzed incessantly on the glass desk, each vibration a tiny earthquake. He didn't need to check the screen to know what was happening. Evelyn Carver had struck. The headline screamed across his laptop, "Langston Innovations, Tech Titan, or Political Powder Keg." The byline belonged to a tech rag known for chewing up startups and spitting out their bones. And the article was a masterstroke of insinuation. Marcus's move against the Meridian painted as reckless, divisive, a dangerous overreach that spooked investors. By 6 a.m., the stock ticker on his second monitor showed a 4% dip, a red gash slicing through the numbers. He didn't flinch, not yet. The office was quiet, the hum of the HVAC the only sound as he poured a black coffee from the machine in the corner. The steam curled upward, a faint ghost in the dim light, and he let it burn his tongue on the first sip, sharp, grounding. His team would be awake soon, and the panic would spread like wildfire if he didn't act. Sasha's text came first. "Board's freaking out. Richard wants a call now." Malik followed. "X is a mess. People saying we're done." Marcus set the mug down, the ceramic clinking against glass, and straightened his tie. This wasn't a stumble. This was war. By 7 a.m., the office buzzed with tension. The open-plan floor, usually a hive of clicking keyboards and low chatter, felt like a pressure cooker. Analysts darted between desks, screens flashing with stock charts and trending hashtags. Langston sinks. Tech woke fail. Sasha stormed in, her tablet clutched like a weapon. "Evelyn's behind this," she said, voice clipped. "Planted the story through a shell PR firm. They're hitting us where it hurts. Investor confidence." Marcus leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough," she said. "Richard's already drafting a memo to pull back, distance us from the Meridian mess. He thinks we're too exposed." Marcus's jaw tightened. Richard, white-haired, old money, the board's resident coward, had been a thorn since day one, always pushing for pragmatism over principle. "He doesn't get a vote yet," Marcus said. "Get everyone in the conference room, 15 minutes. Sasha nodded and vanished, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm down the hall. Marcus turned to the window, the city waking below, cars snaking through streets, lights flickering on in high-rises. Evelyn wanted him to bend. She'd miscalculated. The conference room was a crucible when he walked in. 50 pairs of eyes, engineers, marketers, analysts, tracked him, some wide with fear, others narrowed with doubt. The long table gleamed under recessed lights, but the air felt heavy, thick with the unspoken questions. Malik stood at the front, arms crossed, his usual grin replaced by a tight line. Sasha flanked the projector, her tablet synced to a screen showing the plummeting stock line. Marcus didn't sit. He stood at the head, hands in his pockets, and let the silence stretch until it hurt. "We're under attack," he began, his voice low but resonant, cutting through the hum of the projector fan. Not from a competitor's code or a rival's pitch, from a story, a lie, saying we're too loud, too bold, too us to survive. They're betting you'll blink. I'm betting you won't. He paused, scanning the room. A junior coder, Priya, shifted in her seat, her fingers twisting a pen. An older engineer, Tom, stared at the table, jaw clenched. Langston Innovations isn't just tech, Marcus continued. It's a promise. We don't build apps. We build value. Value no one can steal, no matter how hard they try. And right now, they're trying. The room stirred, heads lifted, spines straightened. Marcus stepped forward, his shadow falling across the stock chart. They want us to apologize for standing up, for calling out what's wrong. I won't. We won't. Because if we do, every door we've opened for ourselves, for people who look like me, like you, slams shut again. He tapped the table, a sharp rap that echoed. This isn't a retreat. This is a counterstrike. We double down. We show them who we are. Malik nodded, a spark igniting in his eyes. Sasha tapped her tablet, pulling up a draft press release, short, unapologetic, reaffirming their stance. Priya raised a hand, tentative. What about the investors? She asked. They're bailing. Marcus met her gaze. Some will. The ones who stay are the ones we want. The room exhaled, a collective release, and the energy shifted, fear hardening into resolve. As they filed out, hands clapped shoulders, voices rose in quick, determined bursts. Marcus watched, the weight of their trust settling on him like armor. Outside, the sun climbed higher, but the storm was just beginning. Marcus didn't sleep that night. The office lights stayed on, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, their edges sharp against the polished grain, as he pored over the data Jamal had dug up. Meridian's internal memos, Apex's financial ties, a sprawling web of quiet power stretching across the West Coast, like a spider's silk glinting in the dark. The clock ticked past 2:00 a.m., its soft rhythm a metronome to his focus. The city beyond the glass, a tapestry of muted glows. Streetlights bleeding into fog, high-rises piercing the haze. His phone buzzed again on the desk, a relentless pulse against the stillness. Another X post, this one from a verified account. Langston's playing victim. Tech doesn't need a martyr. He swiped it away, the sting brief but real. A needle prick to a wound he'd carried since he was old enough to notice the world's sideways glances. Evelyn wasn't just hitting his company. She was hitting him where he'd always been vulnerable, his right to exist in this space. A black man in a room that never expected him to own it. The air in the office hung heavy, thick with the scent of stale coffee and the faint metallic tang of overworked printers. Marcus rubbed his eyes, the grit of exhaustion settling in, but his mind stayed razor sharp, slicing through the documents like a blade through paper. Each memo was a brick in the wall he'd been slamming against his whole life. Codes for guest of concern, profiles flagged not for behavior, but for skin. A system so ingrained it didn't need to shout to enforce itself. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and stared at the ceiling, the recessed lights blurring into faint halos. This wasn't new. He'd seen it at 19, walking into that first interview with a resume that should have opened doors, only to be asked if he was delivering pizza. He'd felt it at Stanford, his hand raised in a lecture hall, ignored until the professor called on someone who hadn't cracked the book. Evelyn was just the latest face of it, polished, powerful, and utterly predictable. The knock came at 3:17 a.m., sharp and unexpected, jolting him from the spiral of memory. Marcus looked up, hand hovering over his coffee mug, the ceramic cool against his palm. "Come in," he said, voice rough from hours of silence, a gravelly edge that betrayed the night's toll. The door swung open with a faint groan, and James Torres stepped through, mid-40s, lean as a whip, with a salt and pepper beard framing a face carved by too many battles. His eyes, dark and deep-set, carried a weight Marcus recognized, the exhaustion of fighting a fight you didn't choose. CEO of Torres Tech, a mid-tier startup that had once rivaled Langston Innovations before pivoting to niche AI, James was a name Marcus knew by reputation, scrappy, principled, a survivor who'd clawed his way up from nothing. They'd nodded at conferences, traded small talk over lukewarm coffee, but never allied, until now. "You look like hell," James said, dropping into the chair across from Marcus without invitation. His movements fluid but deliberate, like a man who'd learned to conserve energy for the real fights. He tossed a folder onto the desk, the thud heavy in the quiet, a dull echo against the hardwood. "Thought you'd want this." Marcus arched an eyebrow, reaching for it with a measured calm that belied the adrenaline spiking through him. Inside were emails, dozens of them, between Evelyn Carver and a junior exec at Torres Tech, dated 3 years back. Blackmail in crisp typeface, veiled threats woven into corporate jargon, a playbook to force James into selling his company at a fraction of its worth. "She tried to bury me," James said, voice flat, stripped of emotion, but laced with a bitterness that lingered like smoke. "Same game she's running on you. I didn't bite, but it cost me. Half my team, most of my funding. Took 2 years to crawl back." Marcus skimmed the pages, each line a shard of Evelyn's ruthlessness, her words cold and calculated. "Step aside, or we'll make sure no one touches you." He looked up, meeting James's gaze. "Why now?" he asked, his tone steady but probing, searching for the angle. James leaned back, crossing his arms over a faded blazer that spoke of too many late nights. "Saw your move with Meridian, read the leaks. Figured if she's coming for you, she's coming for anyone who doesn't fit her mold, anyone who doesn't look like her boardroom. And I'm tired of watching her win." His gaze hardened, a steel edge glinting through the fatigue. "You're not the only one she's tried to erase. She did it to me because I wouldn't play her game. Did it to others you'll never hear about." The air shifted, a thread of understanding weaving between them, taut and electric. Marcus set the folder down, leaning forward, elbows on the desk, his fingers steepled. "What's your play?" he asked, voice low, a challenge wrapped in curiosity. James smirked, the first crack in his stoic mask, a flicker of defiance breaking through. "We hit her where she lives, her network. Apex isn't just funding her. They're propping up a dozen hotels, startups, middlemen, all built on the same garbage she pulled at Meridian. We've got the data, you've got the stage." He tapped the folder with a calloused finger. "Let's burn it down." Marcus didn't answer right away. He stood, pacing to the window, the city's pulse faint below, a slow heartbeat of headlights and neon signs. His reflection stared back, shadowed and resolute, a man who'd spent decades turning slights into strength. James was a wild card, bitter, maybe desperate, but the enemy of his enemy was a weapon he couldn't ignore. The stakes were climbing, the board tilting, and Evelyn's shadow loomed larger with every move. "You're in?" he asked, turning back, his voice a quiet command. James nodded, a single firm dip of his chin. "All the way, but we move fast. She's already spinning this. Next conference is in 3 days. Perfect spot to drop the hammer." Marcus exhaled, a plan snapping into focus like a lens sharpening an image. "Get your team ready. I'll handle mine." By sunrise, the alliance was sealed, the sky outside bleeding pink and gold. Sasha met James in the lobby, her skepticism melting into grudging respect as he laid out his intel with the precision of a surgeon. Malik coordinated with Jamal, cross-referencing Torres's emails with Meridian's leaks. Hours of bleary-eyed work that unearthed a gold mine. Apex's contracts with 5 major hotel chains, all with guest profiling clauses buried in fine print, a legal veneer for bias. Marcus watched it unfold from his office, the pieces aligning like code compiling into something unstoppable, a program written in defiance. Evelyn thought she'd cornered him. She'd just handed him the keys to her cage, and he was ready to turn the lock. The Tech West Summit loomed like a thunderhead over San Francisco, its glass-walled convention center, a gleaming fortress of steel and ambition, perched on the edge of the bay. The late morning sun sliced through the fog, casting jagged reflections across the polished facade, while inside, the air buzzed with the restless energy of 2,000 attendees, investors in tailored suits, startup founders clutching prototypes, journalists with notepads poised like weapons. Marcus Langston stood backstage, the weight of the moment pressing against his ribs like a vice. The auditorium beyond the heavy black curtain thrummed with anticipation, a low roar of voices punctuated by the clink of coffee cups and the rustle of programs. He adjusted his cufflinks, silver, engraved with ML, and exhaled slowly, the sound lost in the hum of the AV crew testing mics. James Torres flanked him, his fingers twitching as he tugged at his tie, the knot stubbornly crooked. "You sure about this?" James asked, his voice a gravelly whisper, eyes darting to the sliver of light where the curtain parted. Marcus nodded, his face a mask of calm, though his pulse hammered beneath the surface. "No turning back," he said, the words a vow. The stage lights blazed as he stepped out, a wall of white heat that stung his eyes for a split second before he adjusted. The crowd's murmur faded to a hush, 2,000 faces turning toward him like a tide shifting. His suit, navy, crisp, tailored to every angle of his frame, caught the glare, the fabric shimmering faintly under the spotlight, but his presence eclipsed it. Tall, unyielding, a man who'd walked through fire and brought the ashes with him. He gripped the podium, the cool wood grounding him, and scanned the room, rows of seats stretching back to the shadowed rear, faces ranging from curious to skeptical, a few already whispering into phones. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady, amplified across the cavernous space, each syllable deliberate as a hammer strike. "I'm Marcus Langston, CEO of Langston Innovations. You know me for tech, code that powers your apps, systems that run your businesses. Today, you'll know me for something else." He clicked the remote in his hand, and the massive screen behind him flared to life, Meridian's internal memos in stark Helvetica, Apex's contracts highlighted in red, a timeline of quiet corruption stretching back a decade, each date a scar. The room shifted, a ripple of unease spreading like a current. Heads tilted, eyes narrowed, a few investors in the front row leaned forward, their polished loafers scuffing the carpet. Marcus didn't pause. "This isn't about one hotel," he said, pointing to the screen, his finger a blade slicing through the air. "It's about a system, hotels, venture firms, gatekeepers, who decide who belongs based on what they see, not what you've built. I've got the receipts." He clicked again, and James's emails flashed up, Evelyn Carver's words in stark black and white. "Sell, or we'll make sure you're uninvestable." The text hung there, raw and unfiltered, and gasps punctured the silence, sharp intakes of breath echoing off the glass walls. Heads swiveled, whispers erupting in clusters, reporters scribbling, a venture capitalist in a gray pinstripe suit muttering to his neighbor. Marcus let it sink in, his gaze sweeping the room, catching the flicker of recognition in some eyes, the discomfort in others. He'd seen those looks before, classrooms, boardrooms, streets, people sizing him up, deciding he didn't fit before he'd even opened his mouth. Then she appeared. Evelyn Carver strode from the wings, her heels clicking like gunfire on the hardwood stage, each step a calculated assault. Her tailored blazer, charcoal, sharp as a razor, hugged her frame, a shield of confidence that gleamed under the lights. The crowd parted, a sea of suits shifting to let her through, eyes darting between her and Marcus like spectators at a duel. She snatched a wireless mic from a stunned AV tech, her manicured nails flashing red, and turned it on with a flick. "This is slander," she snapped, her voice cutting through the room, crisp and cold, slicing over the low rumble of the audience. Mr. Langston spinning a narrative to save his sinking ship. Apex stands for innovation, not division. She pivoted to face the crowd, a practiced smile blooming across her face. Too perfect, too polished, the kind of grin that sold lies to boardrooms. "Let's not let one man's grudge derail progress," she said, her tone softening, coaxing, as if soothing a restless child. A few heads nodded in the back, older men with silver hair and vested interests, their lips pursed in approval. Marcus didn't blink. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing hers on the stage, the spotlight bending around him like a halo-turned weapon. The air thickened, the space between them crackling with unspoken history. Not just this fight, but every fight he'd faced since he was a kid in Oakland, every door slammed because his skin didn't match the key. "You built your empire on other people's backs," he said, his voice low but lethal, each word a stone dropped into still water. "I built mine to lift them up. The difference isn't a grudge, it's a choice." He clicked the remote one last time, and a leaked audio file roared to life through the speakers, Evelyn's voice cold and clear, stripped of pretense. "Profile the ones who don't fit. Keeps the brand clean." The words echoed, bouncing off the glass walls, and the room erupted, shouts of outrage clashing with bursts of applause, a chaotic symphony of reaction. Cameras flashed like lightning, freezing the moment, Evelyn's face pale and taut, her smile cracking at the edges. Marcus standing still, unbowed, the truth laid bare. She froze, the mic trembling in her hand, her eyes darting to the crowd as if searching for an escape. A reporter in the third row leapt up, shouting a question lost in the din. An investor near the aisle slammed his program down, his face red with fury or shame, hard to tell which. Marcus didn't gloat. He turned to the audience, his voice rising over the chaos, steady as a drumbeat. "This ends when we stop letting it happen," he said, pausing to let the weight settle. "Your move." He walked off, the stage lights dimming behind him, James trailing with a tight nod, his shoulders squared for the first time that day. The auditorium dissolved into pandemonium, reporters scrambling for the exits, their phones already live streaming, investors dialing frantically, voices overlapping in a frantic buzz, startup founders exchanging wide-eyed glances, some grinning, others pale. Backstage the air was cooler, the roar of the crowd muffled by the curtain. Marcus leaned against a wall, his breath steadying, the adrenaline still coursing through him. James clapped his shoulder, a rare grin breaking through. "You just lit a match," he said. Marcus nodded, his eyes distant. "Let's see what burns." By noon, X was ablaze, hashtags spiking like wildfire, James apex exposed, James Langston fights, threads exploding with clips of the audio, the memos, Marcus's final words. Companies move fast. 3 announced they'd cut ties with Apex and Meridian within the hour, their statements curt but damning. Incompatible values. By 1 p.m., 10 more followed, a domino effect rippling through the industry. The hammer had fallen, and the sound of it echoed far beyond the glass walls of Tech West. But Marcus knew this wasn't the end. As he stepped into the green room, the noise fading behind him, he caught his reflection in a mirror. Tired eyes, clenched jaw, a man who'd won a battle but not the war. Evelyn's empire was cracking, but the system she served was older, deeper, a beast with too many heads. He straightened his tie, the gesture automatic, and turned away. The fight wasn't over. It was evolving. The fallout was swift and brutal. By dusk, Meridian's Palo Alto branch shuttered its doors, the circular driveway empty save for a lone security guard staring at his phone, the blue glow illuminating his vacant expression. Inside, the lobby's marble gleamed under dimmed lights, a ghost town of abandoned check-ins and untouched coffee urns, their silver surfaces fogged with condensation. The closure notice hit the wire at 6 p.m. Temporary, they claimed, a hollow word plastered across press releases. But the stock plunge told a different story. A 12% drop in hours, a hemorrhage of trust no PR spin could bandage. Evelyn's fate followed with mechanical precision. Apex's board ousted her in a late-night vote. The press release sterile but pointed, leadership transition due to recent events. No names, no apologies, just the cold language of corporate survival. Marcus watched it unfold from the Orion Hotel's rooftop bar, the city sprawling below like a chessboard he'd just swept clean. The air was crisp, tinged with salt from the bay, and the skyline glittered, a mosaic of glass and steel, indifferent to the chaos he'd unleashed. Sasha sat across from him, nursing a whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light of the bar's pendant lamps. "You did it," she said, her tone more weary than triumphant, her fingers tightening around the glass as if anchoring herself. "They're bleeding." Marcus sipped his water, the ice clinking softly against the rim, a sound too delicate for the weight of the moment. "Not enough," he said, his voice low, edged with something unresolved. He set the glass down, condensation pooling on the table, and stared into the distance where the Meridian silhouette had once loomed. His phone buzzed, a blocked number slicing through the quiet. He answered, the device cool against his ear, and a voice rasped through, distorted but deliberate. "Nice win, Langston, but this isn't over." The line went dead before he could respond, leaving a void that hummed with menace. He set the phone down, its black screen reflecting the bar's faint glow, and stared at it, the threat coiling in his gut like smoke. Sasha frowned, leaning forward, her brow creasing. "Who was that?" Marcus shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "Someone who doesn't like losing." The words hung there, heavy, a shadow creeping into the victory's fragile light. He flexed his fingers, the knuckles cracking softly, and glanced at the city again, its calm facade a lie hiding the currents now stirring beneath. Back at the office, the team celebrated, their voices spilling through the halls like a dam breaking. Malik popped a bottle of sparkling cider, the fizz hissing as it overflowed onto the carpet, and Priya laughed for the first time in days, a sound sharp and bright against the day's grind. They toasted to resilience, to Marcus, their glasses clinking in a ragged symphony. But he stayed quiet, perched on the edge of a desk, his mind turning over the call, the stock charts, the unseen hands tightening their grip. Was it worth it? The stock had stabilized by evening, clawing back to a shaky equilibrium, and the narrative had flipped. X now buzzed with Marcus Langston rises alongside the threats. But the cost was a target on his back, red and pulsing. He'd exposed a nerve, raw and quivering, and something bigger was waking up, its shape still blurred, but its intent unmistakable. That night, alone in his condo, he sat on the couch, the city's hum faint through the walls, a dull pulse against the silence. His laptop glowed on the coffee table, X posts scrolling in a relentless stream, praise from supporters, venom from detractors, a flood of noise he couldn't mute. "Hero of the hour," one read. "Arrogant fool playing race card," countered another. He closed it with a soft click, leaning back into the cushions, the leather cool against his neck. The wind felt hollow, not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't the end. The system didn't break. It bent, flexing under his strike only to coil tighter for the next round. He exhaled, slow and steady, the breath a ritual of control, steeling himself for the fight he knew was coming. He rose, crossing to the window, and pressed a hand against the glass, its chill seeping into his palm. Below, a taxi idled at a stoplight, its yellow paint dulled by the night, and a woman hurried across the street, her coat flapping in the wind. Life moved on, oblivious, but Marcus felt the weight of every step he'd taken to get here. The kid from Oakland who'd coded on a borrowed laptop, the man who'd turned rejection into a billion-dollar empire. This wasn't just about Meridian or Evelyn. It was about the invisible lines he'd crossed, the ones they'd redraw to keep him out. The phone sat silent on the couch, a black omen, and he knew. The next call wouldn't be a warning. It'd be a move. He turned away, the city's lights flickering in his periphery, and braced for the storm. The condo was dark when Marcus unlocked the door, the only light a sliver of moonlight cutting through the blinds. He dropped his keys on the counter, the clink echoing in the stillness, and crossed to the bookshelf. There, in a simple black frame, was a photo. Him at 19, skinny and grinning, standing outside a community center after his first coding boot camp. The memory hit hard. The interviewer who'd asked if he was there to fix the AC, the 2-hour wait that ended in a shrug and a "we'll call you." He hadn't yelled then. He'd walked away, found another door, and kept building. He sank into the armchair, the photo in his lap, and traced the edges with his thumb. That kid didn't know he'd be here. CEO, warrior, a name that echoed beyond Oakland's cracked sidewalks. But the fight hadn't changed. The Meridian, Evelyn, the voice on the phone, they were the same gatekeepers, just in sharper suits. He'd won today, but the war was older than him, deeper than him, a current he'd been swimming against since he could walk. A knock broke the quiet. Malik stood in the doorway, a paper bag in hand. "Figured you wouldn't eat," he said, stepping in. He set the bag on the counter, takeout from the diner they had hit after late nights, and pulled out a chair. "Team's got something for you," he added, sliding a folder across. Marcus opened it. A proposal, handwritten by Priya and signed by a dozen others. The Langston Code Scholarship, mentoring and funding for black coders. "They want your name on it," Malik said. "Said you're the reason they're here." Marcus stared at the page, the ink blurring slightly. For the first time that day, a smile tugged at his lips. Small, real. "Tell them yes," he said. Malik grinned, leaning back. "Knew you'd say that." They sat in silence, the city breathing outside, and Marcus felt it, a shift, not an end, but a beginning. The photo stayed in his hands, a reminder of where he'd started, and the folder beside it, a promise of where he'd go. The storm had passed, but the horizon was still dark. He was ready. The auditorium at Langston Innovations headquarters buzzed with anticipation, a low hum of voices threading through the air like static before a storm. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the polished concrete floor, each occupied by a young face. Coders, dreamers, kids from neighborhoods Marcus Langston knew too well. Overhead, recessed lights cast a warm glow, softening the industrial edges of the room. A banner hung against the back wall, bold black letters on a white field. Langston Future Fund, opening doors, writing code. Tonight wasn't about investors or boardrooms. It was about something bigger. Marcus stood at the edge of the stage, his charcoal suit swapped for a simpler black blazer and white shirt. The open collar, a quiet rebellion against the day's earlier battles. He adjusted the mic clip to his lapel, the faint crackle of static cutting through the chatter. The crowd hushed, eyes locking onto him, not with the guarded curiosity of the Meridian staff, but with something raw, something hungry. He stepped to the podium, hands resting lightly on its edges, and let the silence build for a beat longer than necessary. It wasn't a pause for effect. It was a moment to feel the weight. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice steady, resonant, cutting through the room like a blade through silk. "This isn't a victory lap. It's not about what happened last week, or what I've built, or what anyone tried to take away. I'm not here to tear anything down." He paused, scanning the faces, brown, black, tan, some pale, all young, all waiting. "I'm here to build something, to make doors that no one can close again." The room erupted, not in wild cheers, but in a deep rolling applause that vibrated through the floor. Marcus didn't smile, not yet. He leaned forward, his gaze steady. 20 years ago, I was you, sitting in a room not much bigger than this, with a borrowed laptop and a chip on my shoulder bigger than my dreams. I walked into spaces where people saw my skin before they saw my code. They asked me to wait outside, to prove I belonged, to explain why I dared to be there. And every time, I had a choice, fight their way or build mine. He stepped away from the podium, pacing slowly, the mic amplifying each word. I chose to build. Langston Innovations isn't just a company, it's a promise. And this fund? He gestured to the banner. This is for you. Scholarships, mentorships, a chance to write the future without begging for a seat at someone else's table. Because the world doesn't give you power. You take it, you make it, you code it into existence. The applause swelled again, louder now, punctuated by shouts, sharp, joyful bursts from the back. Marcus raised a hand, quieting them. "But let me be clear," he said, his tone hardening. "This isn't charity. This isn't a handout. This is investment. You're not here because you need saving. You're here because you're the ones who'll save the rest of us. So, don't thank me. Prove me right." He stepped back, and the room ignited, clapping, stomping, a wave of energy that crashed against the walls. Malik slipped onto the stage beside him, a tablet in hand, grinning despite the exhaustion lining his eyes. "You sure you don't want to run for office?" he muttered. Marcus shot him a look, half amused, half warning. "I'd rather debug a server blindfolded," he said. And Malik chuckled, stepping aside as the event coordinator waved Marcus toward the crowd. The next hour blurred, handshakes, photos, quick words with donors who'd chipped in after the Meridian fiasco went viral. The air smelled of coffee and ambition, a mix of catered sandwiches and the faint tang of new electronics from the demo stations lining the room. Marcus moved through it all, nodding, listening, his presence a quiet anchor in the chaos. Then she appeared. Her name was Aisha Coleman, barely 20, her braids pulled back in a tight bun, her hoodie emblazoned with a faded logo from a community college Marcus didn't recognize. She clutched a battered laptop under one arm, its edges scuffed from years of use. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, firm but edged with something fragile. He turned, meeting her gaze, dark eyes, sharp, unyielding. "I saw you on the news," she said. "That hotel thing. I watched the whole clip, twice. You didn't yell. You didn't even blink. You just left." And they fell apart. Marcus tilted his head, waiting. She shifted her weight, the laptop creaking slightly. "I've been coding since I was 14, she went on. "Self-taught. My school didn't have a computer lab, just a teacher who said I'd be better off in cosmetology. I saw you walk away from that place and I thought, he's like me. I mean, not the money or the suit, but you get it. I knew I could do this." She tapped the laptop. "I'm building an app. It's not done, but it's mine. And I'm here because of you." The words landed heavy, not because they flattered him, but because they echoed. Marcus saw himself in her, the kid who'd hauled a thrift store PC home at 16, who'd stayed up nights untangling lines of BASIC, while his mom worked doubles at the hospital. He nodded, slow, deliberate. "What's it do?" he asked. Aisha blinked, caught off guard. "The app, it tracks food waste, connects restaurants to shelters. Small scale for now." Marcus crossed his arms. "Not small," he said. "Necessary. Send me the pitch. We'll talk." Her face split into a grin, quick and bright, before she caught herself and nodded professionally. "Yes, sir. Thank you." She stepped back, disappearing into the crowd, but Marcus felt her words linger, a weight pressing against his chest. Responsibility wasn't new to him. He'd carried it since the first line of code he'd written. But this was different. This was legacy, raw and unpolished, staring him in the face. Malik reappeared, tablet still glowing. "She's a firecracker," he said. "Reminds me of you, minus the brooding." Marcus didn't respond, his eyes drifting to the banner. "She's why we're here," he said finally. "Not the headlines, not the hotel, her." Malik nodded, tapping something into the tablet. "Noted. You sticking around? Sasha's got the donor list squared away." Marcus shook his head. "I need air. Wrap it up for me." He turned, slipping through a side door into the quiet of the hallway, the noise fading behind him like a tide pulling back. Outside, the night was crisp, the sky a deep indigo streaked with city lights. Marcus leaned against the building's glass facade, the cool surface grounding him. The event had been a success, $2 million pledged, 50 kids signed up, a ripple that would grow. But success didn't erase the ache, the quiet bruise of knowing how many Aishas were still out there, unseen, unheard, waiting for a door to crack open. He exhaled, his breath fogging briefly in the chill, and let the thought settle. This was the start, not the end. The office was silent when Marcus returned, the hum of the event replaced by the faint whir of air conditioning and the distant pulse of traffic beyond the windows. He dropped into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and powered on his desktop. The screen flared to life, casting a blue glow across the room, empty coffee mugs, a stack of reports, a photo of him and his dad outside their old duplex, both grinning despite the peeling paint behind them. It was past midnight, but sleep wasn't an option, not yet. His inbox pinged, a single new message stark against the clutter of unread threads. No subject line, just a sender. Anon 4782 says securemail.net. Marcus frowned, his cursor hovering. Spam, maybe, or a late donor pitch. He clicked anyway. The email loaded, plain text, no formatting, the words cold and precise. "Congratulations on your win, Langston. The Meridian was a nice scalp. But Carver wasn't the only one watching you. She wasn't even the biggest. Check the attachment. You're not as safe as you think." No signature. Marcus's pulse quickened, a steady thump against his ribs. He scrolled down, nothing else, just a file labeled IMG043.jpg. He hesitated, fingers brushing the mouse. Could be a virus, a trap. But curiosity or instinct won out. He double-clicked. The image snapped into focus, a grainy shot of him, standing outside the Orion Hotel mid-speech, mid-stride, his face sharp against the blurred backdrop of the crowd. The angle was high, off to the side, someone on a balcony, maybe, or a drone. Time-stamped, 2 days ago, 3:47 p.m. Marcus stared, his mind racing. This wasn't a fan photo, this was surveillance. He grabbed his phone, thumbing Sasha's number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice groggy but alert. "Boss, it's 1 a.m. You okay?" Marcus didn't preamble. "I need you in the office. Now. Bring Jamal. We've got a problem." A pause, then the rustle of movement. "On my way," she said, and the line clicked dead. 20 minutes later, they were there. Sasha in a hoodie and jeans, Jamal bleary-eyed but clutching his laptop. Marcus spun the monitor toward them, the email still open. "Read it," he said. Sasha scanned it first, her jaw tightening. "This a threat?" she asked. Jamal leaned in, squinting at the photo. "That's pro level," he said. "Metadata's stripped, but the lens, probably a telephoto. Someone knew what they were doing." Marcus leaned back, arms crossed. "Who's someone?" he asked. Sasha tapped the desk, thinking. "Could be Meridian doubling down. Revenge play." Jamal shook his head. "Nah. They're too busy imploding. This feels bigger." Marcus nodded, the email's words looping in his head. "She wasn't even the biggest." "Evelyn Carver," he said. "She's the obvious pick. But if she's not the top dog, who is?" Sasha pulled out her phone, scrolling through notes. "Apex Ventures took a hit after we exposed her. Stocks down, board's pissed. She's out as of yesterday. Quiet resignation. If she's behind this, it's personal, not corporate." Jamal set his laptop on the desk, cracking his knuckles. "Give me an hour," he said. "I'll dig. Dark web, X posts, whatever's floating out there." Marcus gave a curt nod. Do it. While Jamal worked, Marcus paced, the room shrinking with each step. Evelyn had been a shark, ruthless, calculated, but a pawn? That didn't sit right. She'd had power, leverage, a network. If she answered to someone, they'd been invisible until now. His mind flipped back to the Meridian, the coded memos, the years of quiet bias baked into their system. That wasn't one hotel's playbook. That was a blueprint, replicated, refined. By who? Jamal's voice broke the silence. Got something? He turned the laptop, a forum thread glowing on the screen, anonymous posters, cryptic handles. Langston's a problem, one wrote. Too loud, too fast. Carver was the warning shot. Another. Consortium's not happy. Next move's already greenlit. Marcus leaned in, reading. Consortium? He asked. Jamal scrolled. No names, but chatters pointing to a group. Tech giants, old money, maybe both. They don't like disruptors, especially not ones who don't play by their rules. Sasha cursed under her breath. So Evelyn was their front. Meridian was a test. They wanted to see if you'd break. Marcus's eyes narrowed. And when I didn't, they took notice. Jamal nodded, pulling up another post. He's not just a CEO. He's a symbol. That's the real threat. The words hit Marcus like a punch. Not fear, but clarity. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about what he represented. A black man who'd built an empire, who wouldn't bend, who'd turned their game board into kindling. Options? Sasha asked, her voice all business. Marcus stopped pacing, facing them. We don't react, we investigate, quietly. Find out who's in this consortium, what they want, how deep it goes. No press, no noise, just facts. Jamal grinned, already typing. My kind of party. Sasha nodded, but her eyes held a flicker of worry. This could get ugly, Marcus. Uglier than Evelyn. He met her gaze, unflinching. It's been ugly since I started. I'm still here. They worked until dawn, Jamal trawling data, Sasha cross-referencing Apex's board with industry whispers, Marcus piecing it together. By 6 a.m., they had a thread. Coded mentions of a meeting, encrypted invites, names obscured, but tied to Silicon Valley's heaviest hitters. Not proof, not yet, but a shape. A shadow of something vast, coiled, waiting. Marcus stood, stretching. The photo still burned into his mind. They want a war, he said, more to himself than them. Fine. I'll give them one they can't win. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt awake, sharp, alive, the way he had at 19, staring down a world that didn't see him. The fight wasn't over. It was evolving, and he was ready. The sun was a thin red line on the horizon when Marcus stepped into his office. The city below still half asleep. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, just coffee and adrenaline, a fuel he'd run on too many times to count. The desk was a war zone, laptops, notepads, Sasha's crumpled energy drink can. He ignored it, moving to the floor-to-ceiling window, the glass cool against his palm. San Francisco sprawled beneath him, towers of steel and ambition, streets that had chewed up dreamers and spat them out. He'd beaten those odds. Now, new ones loomed. His phone buzzed, Malik texting, fund launch trending. Apid's Langston legacy's up. You see this? Marcus glanced at it, then set the phone down. Legacy wasn't a hashtag. It was Aisha's laptop, Jamal's late-night hustle, the kids who'd never have to wait outside because he'd kicked the door down. He pulled a notepad from the desk, scribbling a quick note in his tight, precise handwriting. Team, we don't stop. We build. More tomorrow. He'd pin it to the board later. For now, he needed to think. The consortium, whatever it was, hadn't shown its face, but its shadow was everywhere. The email, the photo, the forum threads, they weren't threats. They were markers, a line drawn in the sand. Marcus replayed the past week. The Meridian's collapse, Evelyn's fall, the summit's triumph. He'd thought he'd won. He'd been wrong. Winning wasn't the point. Surviving was. Thriving was. And that meant moving faster, smarter, before the shadow struck. He sank into his chair, pulling up the company's internal server. Files flashed by, projections, code bases, the app Aisha had emailed him an hour ago, a rough but brilliant prototype. He skimmed it, nodding to himself. She'd get funding, a team, a shot. But it wasn't enough. He typed a memo, fingers flying. Expand the fund, double the scholarships, partner with community colleges, not just elites. Start now. He hit send, CCing Sasha and Malice. The consortium could watch. He'd give them something worth seeing. A knock broke his focus. Jamal, bleary but wired, a USB drive in hand. Preliminary list, he said, tossing it onto the desk. 10 companies, maybe 12. Big names, think Google tier, but quieter. Old VCs too. Can't confirm yet, but the chatter's hot. Marcus plugged it in, scanning the names. Faceless giants, dynasties he'd pitched to and been ignored by years ago. Motive? He asked. Jamal shrugged. Control. You're not just a player. You're rewriting the game. They don't like that. Marcus leaned back, the pieces clicking. They've been at this longer than me, he said. The Meridian wasn't a fluke. It's their system. Gatekeepers at every level, keeping us out. Jamal nodded, slumping into a chair. So what's the move? Expose them? Marcus shook his head. Not yet. We need proof. Hard, cold, undeniable. Then we hit. Not with noise. With action. The day unfolded in a blur. Meetings, calls, Sasha rallying legal for a discreet probe into the consortium's ties. By late afternoon, Marcus stood at the window again, the sky now a bruised purple, the city lights flickering on. He felt the weight again, not fatigue, but purpose. He grabbed his coat, slipping out before anyone could stop him. The air outside was sharp, the streets alive, cars honking, a busker strumming a guitar, life pulsing despite the shadows. He walked, no destination, just motion. His mind churned, the consortium's reach, Aisha's app, the kids at the launch. He stopped at a crosswalk, the signal red, and caught sight of a boy, maybe 10, black, skinny legs pumping a beat-up bike. The kid glanced up, locking eyes with Marcus. A grin flashed quick and unguarded before he pedaled off into the dusk. Marcus stood there, the signal turning green, people brushing past. He nodded, a silent promise, to the boy, to Aisha, to himself. Back at the office, he paused at the doorway, the lights off, the space still. He flicked them on, the hum returning, and crossed to the window one last time. The horizon glowed red, fierce, unyielding. He thought of his dad's words. You can't make them see you, but you can make them feel you when you're gone. He'd built something they couldn't ignore, not a company, but a movement. The consortium could come. He'd be ready. The twist wasn't the threat. It was the realization. Power wasn't in beating them. It was in outlasting them, in planting seeds they couldn't uproot. Marcus turned from the window, his silhouette stark against the glass, and stepped into the night. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. And somewhere out there, a kid on a bike was watching, waiting for his turn.